dear friends, dear colleagues. Today we are very happy to have Professor Stephen Crow from Rice University with us. Professor Stephen Crow has been teaching in Rice University since 1983. He specialized in broad range of areas from phenomenology, philosophy of mind, moral psychology, 19th and 20th century continental philosophy to theories of meaning. For years, he participated in a team taught and interdisciplinary course devoted to thinking critically about some key moments in the history of Western art, literature, philosophy, and religion. What unified his interest in these various humanistic areas was their common concern with meaning, not the meaning of life, which is certainly part of the issue, but rather what meaning is and how something can mean anything at all. This, as he came to argue in his first book, Husserl, Heidegger, and the Space of Meaning, is a fundamental question of philosophy and is most productively explored by means of the phenomenological method. Much of his subsequent research has been devoted to the cognitive, epistemic, metaphysical, ethical, and political implications of adopting a phenomenological approach. In his 2013 Normative and Phenomenology in Husserl and Heidegger book, he analyzes the normative structure of meaningful experience, leading to his two current research projects, the relation between phenomenology and traditional conceptions of metaphysics, and a normativity first account of what reasons are. So this time we invited Professor Stephen Crow to mainly focus on the issue of normativity. So I selected 4 lectures. We try to unify with each other, namely on the one hand, focus on the phenomenological account of the source of normativity. So in this issue, we will see the first 3 lectures. First, the normativity, the source of normativity from Heideggerian perspective. And then we will think about how Heidegger contributes, especially in his Zusammenseins, being and time, how contribute to this source, understanding of the source. And then we will move to the second person standpoint from Stephen Double and also from Levinas. And finally, we will have a methodological reflection, namely on the limits of phenomenological thinking and also its relation to metaphysics. So this is a general plan for our 4 lectures in this week and the next week. So today we will start with the first lecture. The title is Commitment, What is Self-Binding and How is it Possible? Please join me to welcome Professor Stephen Crow.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to give this series of lectures at Peking University and to friends in China and elsewhere who are able to join us for this series. I plan to start with a general topic of commitment, and many of the issues that come up in this text will be more carefully examined in subsequent lectures. There are a lot of, as we say, balls in the air here. And so I know there are many issues that I go by rather quickly. And I hope we can clear up some of the inevitable difficulties in the question period. I'm going to read my text. I have tried to shorten it to fit into the context of these lectures and have eliminated all the references and attributions of quotations, but I hope that it will nevertheless be clear enough where the quotations are coming from. But I will put the text on the screen, and you can follow along with that. Somehow this doesn't, let's see. I'm sorry, I'm having a little technical difficulty here. I don't know why that's there. I'm sorry about this. I'm not very technologically adept.
But we can see the text very clearly.
Yeah, but I can't see anyone, or I'm lost here. Let me. I can't see the text. Okay. Ah, yes. Okay, here we go. Get that off of there. Okay. Are you able to see the text now?
Yes.
Okay, well, then let me just begin. And again, it's a great pleasure to be here and talking to you. I have a great fondness for Chinese philosophy and for the context where there are in China, Beijing, where there are many good friends of mine and throughout the country. And so this is a real honor for me to be able to share this with you. So let me just begin with my talk, commitment. What is self-binding and how is it possible? I will argue in this paper that nothing truly binds us in the absence of our ability to bind ourselves to ourselves, an ability which I, following Heidegger, call commitment or resoluteness. There is something paradoxical about commitment, however. For John Hoagland, existential commitment is no sort of obligation, not a communal status, but a resilient and resolute first-person stance. In such a stance, I bind myself by taking responsibility for a way of life in which I am beholden to things in various ways. However, the authority of an existential commitment comes from nowhere other than itself, and it is brought to bear in no way other than by its own exercise. Criticizing this view, Joseph Rouse points to the paradox. A self-determined commitment could have only the semblance of authority, because the authority that a commitment could secure through self-determination is like the authority of a monarch in a country where revolution is legitimate. This paradox has led philosophy to seek the ground of bindingness in some authoritative entity. Natural law, social convention, human rights, ideal consensus, the moral law, God. But as Heidegger notes, we orient ourselves toward beings and yet are never able to say what it is about beings that binds us. This does not mean that we cannot say what binds us. Rather, it means that what binds us does not belong to the order of beings, but to being. Specifically, what it means to be a self. Being bound by beings presupposes the capacity to bind oneself to oneself. This sounds very much like a version of Rouse's paradox. And in order to show why it is not, my argument will be divided into three sections. First, a review of some ways of being bound, together with some consideration of whether we are really bound in any of these ways. Second, an argument based on Heidegger's phenomenology of commitment that we are indeed bound in these ways, but only if self-binding is possible. And third, a concluding sketch of Heidegger's answer to Rouse's paradox. So the first section, some ways of being bound. There are numerous kinds of binding, so let's start small. In German, the term for hyphen is Bindestrich, binding stroke. A hyphen unites two or more words into one, as when Heidegger writes in der Welt sein in order to name a unitary phenomenon. But it can also be used to separate them, as when Heidegger writes Dasein as Dasein, in order to emphasize a certain complexity within an orthographically simple term. In both cases, however, the terms bound by the hyphen belong together only because the phenomenon they designate is already a unity. The hyphen can be read as binding or separating only with an eye towards something else. By itself, the stroke does nothing. The question is, What binds the phenomenon? Another way of being bound provides perhaps the root meaning of the term in English. Odysseus is bound to the mast by leather straps. In Brother, Where Art Thou, George Clooney is bound to his fellow prisoners by chains of iron. In such cases, the chains or straps make it difficult for one thing to separate from another, but they do not make a unity of the two things. In this sense, their binding power is quite limited. Unlike the hyphen, which indicates a real unity in the phenomenon, the binding accomplished by chains is external to what it binds. If I'm able to escape my chains, they no longer bind anything. They temporarily restrict my freedom, but do not touch it. What sort of binding can touch freedom itself? One candidate is found in the English phrase, the ties that bind. This is often used in connection with family relations and suggests an affective union. Let us call this love. Love binds the lover to the beloved. The affect touches my freedom in a distinctive double-sided way. On the one hand, the love I feel for the beloved is not in my power, as I discover if my love is not reciprocated. On the other hand, love invests my freedom, gives it meaning in the form of devotion to the beloved. I am bound to another as to a completion of myself, not another part of myself, but a fulfillment that I cannot provide myself. However, if affective binding can touch my freedom, it cannot really bind it. If I fall out of love, I'm no longer affectively bound. Or if the beloved spurns me in a decisive way, my love will turn into something else, obsession perhaps. The point is that chains of love are no more binding on my freedom than chains that bind the chain gang. Though affective binding does, if perhaps only temporarily, constitute a real unity of two freedoms. Of course, there's another sense of the phrase, the ties that bind, which indicates a different sort of binding, namely that of a special obligation, for instance, to family members, no matter what my affective state might be. Here we arrive at a normative form of binding from which escape seems impossible, one that continues to bind me, apparently, no matter how I feel and no matter where my freedom turns. What must freedom be if it can be bound in this normative way? Rousseau famously argued that man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. One thing he meant to invoke by the chain metaphor is the normative force exerted on the individual by society, that is, by the customs of the social whole. The customary is normative in the sense that it is what is normally done around here, what is expected by and of everyone. Freedom is bound by custom, by civil society, by Sittlichkeit, whose chain consists in social sanction against deviant behavior. Custom thus binds freedom into a unity with other freedoms, and us, whose demand for conformity does not merely touch freedom, but shapes it from within. It does not matter that man is born free. By the time freedom recognizes itself, it is already bound, that is, shaped by the normalizing forms of custom. As Heidegger put it, we are first of all and most of the time das Man, the anonymous anyone of custom. Nevertheless, while such binding does shape freedom, it is not, in fact, inescapable. One can recognize the normative force of the normal and still reject it, act otherwise. Freedom can incorporate the social sanction into itself as a chain whose power to bind is in principle limited. In short, the nonconformist is possible. The nonconformist treats the social role as though it were a chain from which she was already free, as non-binding in the case in which, as in the case in which the prisoner's chain is not normatively binding. If the nonconformist is indifferent to the frowning stares of others, the normative force of the norm, by appeal to which their frowns make sense, disappears. She thus denies the authority of the social norm. Custom does not constitute the kind of bond from which something like an obligation to conform to it could outlast one's free commitment to it. The situation does not significantly change if, in order to deal with the authority problem, social sanction is institutionalized in the form of law. Excuse me. Positive law selects those modes of behavior that a society will not only frown upon, but will punish. And because the norm has been established by the lawgiver, the norm is no longer merely the normal, but the legal. Even if the non-conformist, indifferent to social sanction, does not feel the normative force of the norm, that norm, as law, has authority, and so binds the non-conformist, come what may. Freedom is obligated to obey the law, even if it does not, because the law is nothing but the form of obligation. What can give a norm this sort of authority is not at all clear, however. Why can't non-conformist freedom become revolutionary freedom? An indifference to the law based on a conviction that it lacks legitimacy. But isn't legitimacy just another word for law? Not quite. It is what Heidegger would call the being of the law. This reveals the problem of positive law. A positive law that lacks legitimacy is not a law. It is custom coupled with an institution for sanctioning, namely punishment. Just as the nonconformist who is indifferent to social sanction is not bound by customary norms, so the revolutionary who is indifferent to punishment is not bound by positive law. But what if the revolutionary's conviction is wrong? What if the law has legitimate authority? In such a case, it seems the revolutionary is bound by the law despite her indifference to it. Many questions arise here, of course. Is legitimacy conferred by the authority of the lawgiver to give the law? If so, then the law binds freedom because the lawgiver has the authority to bind in a way that outlasts whatever freedom does. Or is the lawgiver authoritative because its status as a lawgiver is legitimate? If so, then freedom is bound only if the lawgiver's authority is already bound by something that grants legitimacy, the being of the law. The former leads to a theological or quasi-theological natural law doctrine, while the latter anticipates the notion of autonomy, in which the lawgiver's act is already measured by a law that it gives itself. Let us examine each in turn. Laws of nature in the scientific sense bind us in a way that precludes escape. They are chains we cannot break. But this is only because they are not really laws. They are theoretical redescriptions of what is, of what happens. Like the prisoner's chains, they are not normative. Further, unlike those chains, they do not address freedom at all. A doctrine of natural law or natural right, then, must contain a normative moment, an address to freedom, together with the inescapability found in scientific laws of nature. Thus, deviations from natural law are normatively accessible, but the laws themselves just are, like positive law. And so, like positive law, they cannot avoid the question regarding their authority and legitimacy. Such questions can seem inappropriate only if one understands natural law as mere descriptions of what is. And then it is hard to see how supposed deviations from them could be normatively accessible. If natural law is normative, if such law is a chain we can break and still be bound by it, then the origin of its binding character, its legitimacy, must be specified. The natural law tradition answers Deus sive natura. Nature is intrinsically normative, hence an authoritative lawgiver. But if that is so, if nature has the authority not merely to bind freedom conditionally, say in regard to what conduces to optimal flourishing, but also to produce obligations that outlast a commitment to flourishing, the inescapability of the law remains to be accounted for. A divine command theory might serve here, But then we again face the question of whether the legitimacy of the law derives from the authority of the commander, or whether the commander has authority because of the legitimacy of the law commanding. The approach through autonomy seems to fare better as an account of how the law creates an obligation that resists my indifference to or rejection of its legitimacy. The idea is something like this. If freedom can be bound only by a law that it gives itself, that is, if no law can be a real law, that is legitimate, unless its authorship, authority, refers to my own free choice, autonomy, then positive law is binding on freedom only if it is imposed by a lawgiver whose authority reflects my own. If this is so, then the revolutionary might well be justified in being indifferent to positive law, not bound by it, so long as her freedom is not reflected in it. That is, so long as such law does not have the proper origin. But if the revolutionary is wrong, that is, if positive law does reflect her will and is thus legitimately established, then she is indeed bound by the law and stands under an obligation to obey, no matter what she does. This obviously raises many questions, but my concern here is with this one. How is autonomy, self-legislation, possible? How can a law I give myself be binding at all? To be binding across time, such a law must hold even if I change my mind. Otherwise, when I break the law, the obligation seems to vanish. The law is no longer normative for me, since I've simply given myself a new law. Thus, we confront Rouse's paradox. My authority to bind takes place in the context where revolution is legitimate. What sort of response can the theorist of autonomy offer? Perhaps the simplest form of self-binding is the promise. In promising, I obligate myself to do what I promise. If I fail to do it, then I have not given myself a new law. Rather, I have broken my own law, which nevertheless continues to bind me. But how is such self-binding possible? Here, the autonomy theorist must give some account of freedom, that is, must explain what the self must be if it can be bound by normative chains. If freedom is conceived as Willkür, or arbitrary choice, self-legislation will be impossible. So freedom's choices must themselves be seen as universally bound by a law that constitutes freedom as freedom. In Kant, this is the moral law, whose content, the categorical imperative, is given by the form of law itself. Freedom is not freedom unless its maxim conforms to the form of law. Otherwise, it is unfree action authored by contingent factors such as natural inclination, desire, or self-love. As Heidegger notes, Kant conceives freedom under the category of causality, where causality is the law that establishes a necessary connection between antecedent and consequent. If I help a stranger because I'm moved by sympathy, then that act does not issue from freedom, since helping a stranger is only contingently connected to a sympathetic disposition. This is part of what it means to say that love touches freedom, but does not bind it. On the other hand, if I help a stranger because I ought to, that is, because it is my obligation, then the act is free. Its antecedent, namely respect for the law, is necessarily connected to its consequent, since in being done for the sake of the law, it conforms to the form of law. Freedom is thereby severed from Willkür. If I make a promise and do not keep it, I have not made a new law, but have broken my own law, which is a law only because the antecedent is necessarily connected to its consequent, and so is indifferent to time and contingency. The Kantian conception of autonomy has been accused of emptiness, but our interest here lies in another direction, namely in the binding character that is supposed to lie in the very definition of freedom. In what sense is the moral law a form of self-binding or autonomy? Kant's answer is an ontological one. The self is an additive creature composed of rationality and animality. As animal, it is subject to various inclinations. As rational, it can assess these inclinations in terms of reason, the form of law. If reason is practical, if it contains conduct binding laws, then it provides me with a measure of what I ought to do. And if freedom is a kind of causality, then my will is nothing but conformity to this measure. If I act in accord with the measure of my animal nature, I'm in conflict with myself, my own autonomous will. When I act for the sake of duty, in contrast, I bind myself to the moral law and so bind myself to myself. Autonomy is a form of self-binding because it is a way of bringing unity to the duality in my nature. The moral law binds freedom, come what may, because freedom belongs to a creature who, to be a self at all, must assess its animal inclinations by a law that co-constitutes selfhood. Such binding not only shapes freedom, but obligates it. Acting for the sake of duty is a form of self-binding, but am I obligated to care about bringing unity to myself? Christine Korsgaard provides an argument for the necessity about caring for self-unity based on her notion of practical identities. A practical identity is a description under which you value yourself. That is, one under which you find your life to be worth living and your actions to be worth undertaking. Thus, if my practical identity is being a father, then I care about living up to the norms of fatherhood, and I find the actions that are governed by those norms worth doing. Absent such care, I might well know what is normally expected of fathers around here, but it would not motivate me to act in accord with such expectations. Thus, it is because fatherhood is not merely my nominal identity, social normative status, but my practical identity, that I'm self-bound to what is entailed by the norms of fatherhood. They give me practical reasons for what I do. But this sort of self-binding is not unconditional. Not only do I have many and possibly conflicting practical identities, I can also stop caring about whether I live up to the demands of a particular role, lose my commitment to it. Thus, the model of practical identity cannot explain an unconditional obligation to care about bringing unity to myself. Here, Korsgaard introduces a transcendental argument, beginning with an ontological premise. Prior to any practical identities, you are a human being, a rational animal, a reflective animal who needs reasons to act and live. From this, she derives a practical conclusion. In order to have any practical reasons at all, you must take this more fundamental identity, being such an animal, to be normative as well. That is, you must treat your humanity as a practical normative form of identity. And to treat humanity as a practical identity is just to be bound by the moral law. It would seem then that self-binding is both necessary, since without it I cannot be a self, have any practical identity, and possible. Though voluntarism is true, because I'm the authoritative legislator of the law does not derive from my willkür, and so it genuinely binds me. In this case, no revolution is legitimate. However, Korsgaard's picture remains an example of what Heidegger calls being bound by beings, for it depends on a prior ontology that initially makes no reference to the normative. According to Korsgaard, it is simply the truth that you are an animal who needs reasons in order to survive. But from this, nothing normatively binding follows. And so the must in Korsgaard's transcendental argument, to care about anything, you must care about this, has only factive and not practical normative force. Without such an argument, however, which moves from being to beings, we simply cannot say what it is about beings that binds us. Stephen Darwall offers a different approach to autonomy, one that abandons the search for the possibility of self-binding in the self's first-person perspective in favor of what he calls the second-person standpoint. To begin from the second-person standpoint is to focus on the self in the accusative, a you who is the addressee of claims addressed by others. The challenge is to show that claims addressed to me by others contain no authority that could not derive equally from myself. Otherwise, I will no more be bound by such claims than I am by the claims of custom. Darwall's idea is that the phenomenon of being normatively bound is intelligible only if we assume, in the sense of occupy, a second-person standpoint. Such a standpoint presupposes an interdefinable circle of concepts, which include second-person authority, valid claim or demand, second-person reason, and responsibility to, as well as several others, such as second-person standing and second-person competence. Further, the second-person standpoint is ontologically basic. There is no way to break into this circle from the outside. To be a practical self, person then is to possess second-person competence and so be bound already by its entailments. As animals, we are socialized into such competence, but we are persons only within it. Were we to abstract from this interdefinable circle, we would not find a free self, but an entity on whom the relevant normative concepts can get no grip at all. Beginning with the phenomenon of the second-person standpoint seems to eliminate the problem of self-binding, since once second-person competence is achieved, all the normative bonds are interagential, based on our mutual recognition as free and rational agents. But as Darwall acknowledges, this does not do away with autonomy altogether. The second-person standpoint is not an alien force imposed on us as an external authority, nor is it a kind of natural law. Rather, deliberation within the second-person standpoint shows that autonomy belongs among its cluster of conceptual presuppositions. Quote, there can be second-personal authority only if there is second-person competence, and persons can be assumed to have second-person competence only if we can assume autonomy and some form of moral reasoning, such as the categorical imperative. Persons can sensibly be held accountable for complying with norms only if they themselves can accept and determine themselves by them, which is possible only if what makes the demand warranting norms valid is their issuing from a process that people can, at least in principle, go through in their own reasoning and thereby make the relevant demands of themselves. So in principle, the authority of such norms depends on treating oneself as both addressor and addressee. Darwall's position has many affinities with Heidegger's phenomenology of obligation. However, he avoids the paradox of self-binding only by reducing the first-person singular to a pre-social stage in development. Heidegger, in contrast, argues that within the social whole, there is still the ontological question of how, in the first-person singular, I constitute myself as a self, become responsible for being a self. Without this sort of responsibility, the forms of second-person address amount to no more than the claims of custom, a form of life that is not obligatory. In Heideggerian terms, the rational entailments of the second-person standpoint bind a self who has not yet understood itself. Such a self has understood what Darwall calls its responsibility to, that is, its answerability to others, but has not yet understood its responsibility for being a self. Within the second-person standpoint, there is no need for self-binding. I am bound to others through a web of commitments, the web of practical reason, which cannot be further grounded. But if responsiveness to reasons requires not just answerability to others, but also responsibility for what one takes to be a reason, then the commitment to oneself that grounds such responsibility, though invisible from the second-person standpoint, will be a necessary condition for that very standpoint. Thus, we are brought back to square one. What is self-binding and how is it possible? Section 2 there, ontological commitment prior to persons and rational animals. Our examination of autonomy has shown that reason can bind freedom only if freedom is nothing but reason. Once freedom is combined with an animal nature, we cannot say what it is about reason that binds us, since it does not bind the animal in us. Freedom thereby becomes noumenal. To avoid this problem, freedom cannot be a causality exercised contingently by a natural entity. Freedom must be the being of that entity and so belong to every dimension of its behavior. For such an entity, self-binding will not be a matter of law, authority, or legitimacy, but of meaning. From the phenomenological point of view, commitment concerns what it means to be. Heidegger is Kantian enough to recognize that only where there is freedom do we find the possibility of something having a binding character. For Kant, such possibility is opened up by reason. Inclination guides the animal in various directions, but the animal does not encounter the world as affording a normative distinction between what it is inclined to do and what it ought to do. As rational, the animal possesses such a distinction, measured by the moral law, but it remains obscure why the animal should be bound by the moral law. In Heidegger's ontology, this problem cannot arise because an openness to possibility defines the kind of entity we are. Possibility is inseparable from our being in a way that the moral law is not inseparable from the animals. We are beings, as he says, in whose being that being is an issue. To say that my being is at issue is not to say that I'm an animal who struggles for survival, but rather that what it means for me to be is normatively at stake in everything I do and say. Before any form of law, the possibility of something having a binding character already belongs to the phenomenon of meaning, the meaning of being that is at issue in existing. Existing, which Heidegger calls transcendence, is freedom, letting oneself be bound or holding oneself towards something binding. What then is the connection between freedom and the possibility of self-binding? In Being and Time, the argument begins with a phenomenological description of how in everyday life things show up as meaningful in various ways. Though Heidegger does not explicitly discuss it, such meaning entails reference to a norm. Whether I'm absorbed in the task of making a birdhouse, preparing an art installation, or conducting an experiment in the laboratory, things are there for me as suitable or unsuitable, appropriate or inappropriate. That is, they show up in light of what they are supposed to be. The possibility of succeeding or failing at what it is supposed to be is constitutive of our meaningful encounter with anything. Somehow then, a binding measure is already at work in what we do. But this sort of binding is fungible. It binds me to things and things to themselves only so long as I am engaged with tasks. When I'm installing an exhibit of paintings, a thin latex glove is what is called for. Whereas when I'm jackhammering my sidewalk, it fails miserably. Here, the glove has not changed its properties. Rather, those properties are encountered in light of a measure that belongs to them thanks to what I'm doing with the glove. The reason that we are never able to say what it is about beings that binds us, then, is that beings are not in themselves binding. To be encountered as determinate things, as suitable or unsuitable for the job, as confirming or disconfirming a hypothesis, and so on, something must make them binding. The meaning of things has always already been standardized. The social whole, which Heidegger calls das Man, is constituted by what is normally done. And so both the tasks that we engage in and the things that ordinarily pertain to them present themselves as already binding in the way that custom is binding. But while this social normative status is there before anything I do, it is not originary. It does not necessarily bind in the particular case, as we discover whenever a tool is put to new and successful use, or when the non-conforming scientist productively disrupts the whole experimental context. For Heidegger, the normativity of the typical is not ontologically basic. It rests on a deeper binding character than the observance of rules, even rules of thumb. What makes it possible for things to have a binding character? Here, Heidegger's ontology recalls Korsgaard's notion of practical identity. The meaning or suitability of something derives from the work I'm doing with it, but the measure of what I'm trying to do depends on what I'm trying to be. It is because I'm acting for the sake of a practical identity, say being a teacher, that what I'm trying to do with this chalk, this blackboard, these assignments, and those classroom protocols reveals them as appropriate or inappropriate. In Being and Time, acting for the sake of some practical identity is called comportment. And Heidegger identifies comportment with transcendence as freedom. So it is in comportment that we must seek the nature and possibility of self-binding. Acting for the sake of being something, a teacher, father, carpenter, citizen, husband, scientist, means trying to live up to the measure of what it means to be that thing. Thus, it is a kind of self-relation. Dasein comports itself towards its own being, that is, toward a possibility for being. But this kind of possibility is not merely logical. For instance, it is logically possible that I could be a big league baseball player, brain surgeon, or teacher. But as comporting myself toward a possibility for being, I am able to be only a teacher. The others cannot be my comportments because I cannot exercise the relevant skills. I can only think about them. With teaching, in contrast, I can engage with things for the sake of being a teacher because in so acting, the norms of teaching get a grip on what I actually do. But how? They do so because I'm invested in or care about whether I succeed or fail. Ontological possibility is opened up only where my own being is put into play. That is, only in commitment, in which I bind myself to the measure of what it is that I'm trying to be. Freedom is thus norm-oriented from the outset, which is not to say that it is oriented toward reason. Trying to be something, for instance, a teacher, differs from trying to do something, for instance, make a lesson plan, because being something is not measured by an end that is separable from my trying. And since comportment is not measured by outcomes, its measure lies beyond beings, as Heidegger explains. Transcendence is specifically expressed in Plato's Epikenides Thespousias, beyond being. Comportment, understanding, is the primal activity of human existence, and the essence of the agathon, good, lies in its sovereignty over itself as huhenika, as the for the sake of. It is the source of possibility as such. I admit that that's a mystical statement, but we can unpack it later, and I'll come back to it in other lectures. To commit to teaching as one's practical identity, then, is just to act in light of what is good in the matter of teaching, what a teacher should be. As beyond beings, however, the meaning of teaching is settled neither by what I actually do, nor by the norms of teaching current in my social milieu. Instead, freedom understands itself in terms of an exemplar, forbid, that becomes itself exemplary in a performative avowal of what it understands the good in the matter of teaching to be. Freedom provides itself with intrinsic possibility by binding itself, that is, its current behavior, to itself, what it takes, what it means to be what it is trying to be. That there are customs and rules for teaching is undeniable, but what teaching means is available to me only if it is at issue in my comportment. If I don't care about being a teacher, then the measure of teaching does not bind me. As Heidegger puts it, freedom makes Dasein in the ground of its essence responsible to itself, or more exactly, gives itself the possibility of commitment. And the totality of the commitment residing in the for the sake of is the world. For instance, freedom's commitment to an exemplar of teaching opens up the world of teaching, a normatively ordered relational totality of signifying, wherein things can show up according to a measure, and so as what they in truth are. When I act for the sake of being a teacher, I'm beholden to the way things actually are, because my exemplar of teaching makes freedom sensitive to the way things should be. In one of Heidegger's examples, a lecturer experiences the blackboard as badly positioned. That it is badly positioned means that in relation to the lecture theater as a whole, that is to the whole context, the world of teaching is not where it should be. Its position binds the lecturer because of her commitment to teaching. If she is indifferent to its position, she is not performatively avowing her exemplar of teaching. She is failing as a teacher. Commitment to teaching thus yields the counterhold of things upon me. They become more in being, that is, normatively salient, meaningful. And being bound by them means acknowledging my powerlessness over their resistance. The freedom that belongs to commitment is not spontaneity and cannot be localized in a particular activity. There is then no maxim that constitutes my trying to be a teacher, and commitment, unlike autonomy, cannot be measured by a law of reason that binds an antecedent necessarily to its consequent. Anything, even the moral law, can bind me only if I can bind myself to myself through the commitment that belongs to a practical identity. Freedom does not supply me with a rational law of my being, but with the possibility of commitment. And it is through commitment, self-binding, that freedom becomes responsible. In trying to be a teacher, I am responsible for what it means to be a teacher and responsible to the others with whom I am, ultimately to all others. It follows that the ontology of comportment also underlies the world of the person, the rational entailments that constitute the second person standpoint. The world of teaching includes both the normative constraints that bind me to things and the obligations I have toward others, such as students, parents, and colleagues. Being committed to teaching involves addressing claims to these others and being responsive to the claims that others address to me. To say that we cannot understand the interdefinable circle of concepts that make up this second person standpoint from the outside means that its normative order is opaque in the absence of my commitment to acting for the sake of being a teacher. Darwall's analysis of the second person standpoint makes no reference to commitment, but for Heidegger, the second person world of teaching is not a fact governed by rational entailments. It is at issue, grounded in an exemplar of meaning which is beyond beings and so is never determinate. Perhaps we see now why Heidegger says that no thing can bind freedom in the absence of a commitment to some practical identity. But if self-binding is the way freedom makes itself responsible, we might still wonder how such normative self-responsibility is possible. Aren't we simply returned to a version of Rouse's paradox? On the one hand, I'm not obligated to be a teacher, nor anything else for that matter. And so the norms and obligations of teaching are not unconditionally binding. Furthermore, it seems that my avowal of an exemplar of what teaching means is, if not precisely arbitrary, then at least non-binding. To bind myself to one way of going on, one meaning of teaching, does not exclude changing my mind about it, in which case the putative obligations of the original commitment are no longer binding. But if they do not outlast my commitment, were they ever binding in the first place? So final section, Heidegger's answer to Rawls's paradox. Commitment to a practical identity admits one to a world in which one is bound to things and to others by ties of affection, custom, positive law, special obligations, and second-person reasons arising from the good at stake in that identity. But since the binding power of none of these outlasts my commitment, we must look beyond comportment, acting for the sake of practical identities, to find something that binds freedom no matter what it says or does. To address this problem, Heidegger starts with a phenomenological description of our self-relation. Freedom belongs to an entity for whom what it is to be is always at issue. Heidegger's version of Kierkegaard's transcendental argument thus targets a kind of self-binding that is already constitutive of the self's being at issue, a kind of responsibility that is not limited to comportment understood as responsibility for some particular way of being. Such self-binding, I argue, does not yield legislation, but a non-contingent transcendental obligation to account for myself in the space of reasons. Heidegger begins with a phenomenological description of that condition in which I lack commitment to any practical identity, existential breakdown. We'll go into this in more detail in future lectures too. In angst, my affective ties to the world no longer claim me. The world can offer nothing more, and neither can the Dasein with of others. I am no longer drawn by the good of any practical identity. This is a kind of existential death, the possibility of being unable to be anything. Nevertheless, such a condition does not render me a substantial atom in the void. As care, my being remains at issue. This radically first personal self-understanding is articulated in what Heidegger terms the call of conscience. Conscience articulates my guilt, where guilt is not tied to some specific misdeed, but rather identifies a fundamental characteristic of my being responsible for a nullity. So there's a connection between verschuldet, Schuld, and Verantwortlichkeit. What is this nullity? Precisely my not being autonomous, never to have power over my own being from the ground up. I am thrown into a situation which grounds me, my facticity, which includes all that is, including natural, social, and historical conditions. But because my being is also characterized by possibility, Seinkönnen, such givens do not take the form of implacable necessities. Rather, they are never anything but the ground for an entity whose being has to take over being a ground. As existing, I must take over being a ground. What does the must here mean? The key point lies in the ambiguity of the term ground. Grounds in the sense of that which I can never have power over are beings as such, causes, social norms, the ties that bind, laws, all of which, as we have seen, lack intrinsic binding power, normative force. On the other hand, ground also means reason. The must in Heidegger's description of what the call of conscience gives us to understand then means that I cannot not take over being a ground. That is, I must treat my factic grounds in light of possibility, in light of my ability to be. Recalling our earlier discussion, we can say that for Heidegger, to take over my factic grounds in light of my ability to be is to take them up in light of the ideatu agathou, that is, in light of what is best. But this is just to stand toward such grounds as toward potentially normative reasons. What is best as an answer to the question why. freedom's ontological responsibility is not this or that possibility, but to the possibility of commitment, to resoluteness as responsibility for what I take to be justifying reasons for what I do and say. Thus, if comportment binds freedom to an exemplar of the good at stake in what it is trying to be, the breakdown of all practical identities discloses something like a transcendental condition of such binding. Phenomenological description thus uncovers something unconditional in our being. We are not animals who need reasons in order to live. We are beings for whom what it means to be is always at issue. This being at issue is what taking over being a ground means. Heidegger's transcendental argument has consequences for how we think about various ways of being bound. If I must treat my factic grounds as potentially normative reasons, and if to be a self at all is to be with others, then my responsibility for reasons is also my answerability to others for those reasons. Factic grounds include normative claims that others make on me. This does not mean that such claims eo ipso have normative authority, but it does mean that in taking a stand on whether they provide me with reasons to act on them, I'm obliged to give an account of myself to others. Sociality is not definitive of my being in the way that the second person standpoint is definitive of the person, but neither is it optional. The world I inhabit with others is a world of what Rouse calls intraactive phenomena, whose meanings are constituted not by me alone, but by an interlocking set of commitments and entitlements that make the phenomena at issue in them binding on me. While the transcendental possibility of self-binding grounds the possibility of this system of intraactive phenomena, it does not constitute the shape it takes. And once I have committed myself to a way of going on within it, the various claims on freedom, affective, familial, socio-practical, custom, law, bind me in the way peculiar to them, with obligations that outlast my momentary whims. I'm answerable to others for the choices I make in the face of what claims me, and the normative pull of such claims on freedom is the starting point for any way of going on. Without the ability to self-bind in the sense that we have been tracking, the animal could not so much as recognize such things as having normative force. But because self-binding is necessary, they do have such force. Now we can understand Heidegger's answer to Rouse's paradox. Since binding oneself to the normative is ontologically necessary, it is neither escapable nor a matter of self-legislation. And only if self-binding is a matter of self-legislation can questions of authority and legitimacy, which seem to render self-binding paradoxical, arise. The obligation to enter into the space of reasons neither pre-exists my being nor arises from the edict of a lawgiver, myself, whose authority can be overthrown at any time. Rather, freedom just is this kind of responsibility. The reasons that I and others give may all be revisable. Responsibility for relating to my facticity in normative terms, in light of what is best, is not. A self-binding that can outlast any particular commitment, namely my obligation to account for myself in the game of giving and asking for reasons, is thus possible because it is constitutive of my being. Freedom's only options here are between authentic and inauthentic self-binding. This also explains how we can enter into the moral universe of the second person standpoint from a certain outside. Though we are socialized into personhood, the person must be able to take responsibility for the normative claims that constitute it. In conscience, I am both addresser and addressee of a claim. But the claim itself, the call, does not derive from reason. Instead, it directs me toward real dialogue with real others among whom I am. And by way of such a call, I become responsive to the actual reasons of others. Thus, I'm responsible for giving an account of myself, even when I change my mind about, for instance, what it means to be a family member or a citizen. To sum up, while I'm free to abandon my commitment to any practical identity, the ontological possibility of such commitment, freedom, is already bound by a normative claim that outlasts whatever I do or say, namely a responsibility for the normative, or ta'agathon, and so for reasons and reason giving. I'm bound to myself not by beings, things, customs, and laws, but by being. The meaning of things is never ultimately grounded, and so we are never able to say what it is about beings that binds us. But to borrow Merleau-Ponty's apt phrase, we are condemned to meaning by virtue of factic freedom, which affords the possibility of commitment or self-binding. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. I think we can immediately open the discussion session. Any questions, comments, please?
I'm trying to make this. I can't full screen. Where's full screen?
You can simply end the shared screen and then.
But I have lost all my controls. Okay, here we go.
If you go down to the bottom. Oh, yeah, great. Yeah. Okay, any questions? Will you please?
Hello, Professor. Could you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I have two questions. Thank you for your very interesting lecture. The first one is concerning about the second person standpoint. According to your lecture, the second person standpoint is not an alien force imposed on us as an external authority, nor it is a kind of natural law, etc. My question is, if that this power is not an external power, and if I am at the same time the aggressor and the addressee, what's the difference between the second person standpoint and the first person standpoint? This is the first question. The second question concerning about the practical identity. In this paper, maybe according to Coast Guard or Heidegger, that anything can bind me, or if only if I can bind myself to myself through the commitment that belongs to a practical identity. Even the moral law, the binding power of the moral law seems based on this practical identity. But I see that your examples very positive examples, such as to be a teacher, to be a father. But if I were raised in the worst environment and I commit to be a killer or be a villain, what's that my practical identity seems not related to something moral or something about the moral responsibility. I'm afraid that that we base the binding power of the moral law on such a practical identity. Will that be too weak for a moral responsibility in the moral context?
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for these questions. The second question, I'm not sure I got everything that was at issue. So are you suggesting that the obligations that I incur through commitment to a practical identity also contain or are the ground of a moral obligation, or how was the question, how do they relate to one another? For instance, the commitment to being a teacher involves ideas about what it's right for a teacher to do. And are you saying that, are you asking whether the moral law can be, or maybe is even an essential part of those practical identities?
Oh no, her idea, I just try to make it clear. Her idea or suggestion is that if we think about some corrupted community, and then you certainly have something like a practical identity, that also involves some rights and rules to make this commitment realized. But then the problem is these rules could be corrupted at the same time. And then to what extent this practical identity can really help us to understand the rules as moral in the very rigorous moral context.
Right. Well, I think this is why Course Guard has to go beyond the idea of practical identity in the sense of we have numerous practical identities, father, teacher, friend, mother, all of these. And because you can't derive, because these establish normative connections, what we should do and so on in being a father and teacher and so on. But universal moral rules don't come into play at that level. These are as it were, practical obligations that don't yet make any demands. For instance, there's no moral obligation for me to be a teacher or a father. And furthermore, if I'm both a teacher and a father, those things might conflict. And we'll talk about this in later lectures, but I might be committed to the norms of fatherhood, and that would require me to be at home with my sick child. And I might be committed to the norms of friendship, which would oblige me to go out and have some friends, have beer with a friend who was feeling sad for some reason. And there's no way to adjudicate or choose. I have to do one or the other. I can't do both. And you might want to say, well, we need a third law somewhere, like a moral law that says, the moral law says always you should prioritize your family over your friends. But there isn't any way to do that. So insofar as we're always engaged in one practical identity, these conflicts arise and we simply have to hierarchize them. What Course Guard wants to do is, or negotiate them some way or another. And what Course Guard wants to do is find a level above or beyond practical identity. That's why it's a kind of transcendental argument. That would establish a moral law that could adjudicate those kinds of disputes. And so she says, well, that if we read the Kantian formulation of humanity as an end in itself, we can get an idea about this somehow. We can say, as she says, you have to treat your rational animality, or your, in other words, your humanity, as a practical identity. It isn't really one, because she just says it's the truth that we're rational animals. But we have to, she tries to say we must, in order to get to the truly universal moral point of view of morally binding norms, we need this second stage of treating our humanity as a practical identity, and that will give us basically the Kantian structure of the categorical imperative. My claim about that is that we don't have that option. That for one thing, nothing normatively follows from the fact that I'm an animal who needs reasons to survive. Nothing normatively follows from that. And if I treat that as a practical identity, I'm actually importing a kind of rationalism into existence. Heidegger doesn't have that second move. So I think Heidegger's is phenomenologically more accurate, but I can see that Korsgaard wants to establish a Kantian universal rule of reason as a check on moral normativity, or as establishing genuinely moral normativity. I don't think we have that option, but we do have a similar kind of obligation. For instance, when I choose to go out with my friend and comfort him over beers rather than staying home with my sick child, I have an obligation that I can't escape to give reasons for my hierarchization, for the way I have chosen between these practical identities. That's a very thin, I'll admit, notion of moral, universal moral obligation. But the alternative is to, I think, have an empty categorical imperative. I didn't go into the emptiness of Kant's categorical imperative, but I think it's more, it gets us part of what we want in much the way that Habermas's discourse ethics does, but it doesn't get us all the way to strict morality in Korsgaard's sense. The point about Darwall and the first and second person standpoint is that Darwall wants to say that the first person embrace of I'm confronting a person who makes a demand on me. And the idea is that that demand is legitimate only because I can make that demand of myself. And the question then arises, why go through all of this whole business about the second person standpoint? Good point. I think that Darwall is quite honestly tracking the phenomenology of what Husserl calls the person, which is a constituted unity in intersubjectivity. And in that context, there is this reciprocity of claims, but where does the reciprocity come from? And ultimately, my point about autonomy being an element or a concept within the second person standpoint is that Darwall ultimately argues, and this is what he calls Fichte's point. We'll go into this in the next lecture or one of them, that it makes no sense for me to be subject to a second person reason that I couldn't also demand of myself, because in effect, I have to see the justice of that reason for myself in principle. But what he wants to avoid is the idea that monological or solipsistic reason is the basis of our moral life. And he so recasts the whole, what's most interesting about his position is that that instead of starting with the individual subject as a cognitive subject, he starts with the individual subject as the addressee of a claim, as following Fichte's, I think, example. And subsequently, he tries to argue that we need to be able to essentially be both the addresser and addressee. And that would be his reconstruction of what autonomy is. In a later lecture, I'm going to argue that this is wrong in a fundamental way, although a very subtle way. Phenomenologically, I'm going to argue that we can't identify the addresser of the claim. And therefore, we can't take ourselves to occupy that position. So I'm going to criticize Darwall on that point. Is that clear for now? Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Okay, now Dr. Huang Di, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Crowell. It's a very thought-provoking talk. I have quite a few questions, but I'll try to be brief by structuring them around, I think, your dialogue or your critique of Christian Kohlschreiber. So the first question concerns, well, basically the context or dimension of the discussion. So in Kantian terms, it concerns the relation between transcendental freedom and practical freedom. Kohlschreiber, as you know, she is doing moral psychology. She discusses the constitution of free action, of human agency. So she is talking about a practical freedom in the Kantian sense. While you seems to be engaged in a critique of Kohlschreiber, your discussion seems to be taking place in a transcendental register. You seem to be talking about transcendental freedom in the Kantian sense. So there is the worry whether you are talking past each other. Because one could say that transcendental and practical dimensions have different structures, and there are different questions in these dimensions. And this leads then to the second question. It concerns your comparison of the argumentative strategies of Kohlschreiber and Heidegger, according to your interpretation. So you say both of them give some sort of a transcendental argument. And in Kohlschreiber's case, it moves from an ontological premise to a practical conclusion. And in Heidegger's case, you say that it starts from a premise, it starts from a philosophical description of our self-relation, and then it moves towards, well, something like a non-contingent, non-optional self-binding. So here the first question is, well, just I want to know more about how to think about this structure, this argument as transcendental. In what sense do you think about this Heideggerian argument as transcendental? So that's basically a clarificatory one. And then a more substantial question, it concerns, well, the apparent ambiguity of the conclusion of this Heideggerian argument as you reconstructed it. Basically, the conclusion is that as existing, I have to, or I must take over being a ground, right? And you yourself raised the question, what does the must here mean, right? I'm not quite sure you really address that question in the talk, because there seems to be an ambiguity between, on the one hand, there is a more or less a factical must that it is inescapable that I take over being the ground, and then there could be a practical must that I am obliged to take over being the ground, right? So which one of these does the argument really establish? And so basically that's the question.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. I hope that some of the details of these issues will be covered with more finesse in some later lectures. I can't say, but they are all, both of them, all three questions do touch on very important and maybe not fully thought through aspects of my position. So let me just start with the third one. What does it mean, this must? You must take over being a ground. This, in a sense, means that, I mean, it's tempting to think, okay, well, if it's, you can't do anything but take over the being a ground, then that would sound like some sort of causal necessitation or some kind of necessity that isn't going to help us very much. But what I was trying to suggest is that because of Heidegger's basic claim that the fundamental descriptor for our being is that being in whose being that very being is at issue or in question, that that puts such being in a space of indeterminacy at a certain point. And this indeterminacy, you might say, is what he is trying to get at with his notion of breakdown, or the whole call of conscience. And so that's where this having to take over being a ground becomes phenomenologically evident to us. So this would be the contrast case to Korsgaard, just saying, well, it's the truth that we're rational animals. But what differs between Heidegger and Korsgaard on this point is the way in which this necessity or an ontological claim is structured. She just claims we have this, as it were, let me put it this way, an ontological structure over which, or in terms of which, we are not involved somehow. And it's just like a thing with properties. Whereas what I think Heidegger's getting at with this notion of breakdown is an attempt to get at the phenomenological experience wherein we find out that our being is suspended between this kind of ability to be or possibility on the one hand, but within a factic situation. That situation's description is not defined in the way that it is for Korsgaard, say, in terms of animal nature. But it's the structural feature of our being in which I see, in a certain way, that to go on and be a self, and here's the notion of self-unity or bringing unity to myself, I can only confront my factic situation in light of how best I think it should be taken up. And so I think this must, or to put it another way, I cannot not be without engaging in treating factic grounds as potentially justifying reasons, or treating my inclinations in terms of what is best or what ought to be done. This situation is something that is, as it were, made evident to me in this breakdown of my all of my practical identities. It is, as it were, the core of my being. But what's interesting about it is that the core of my being involves being the addressee of this call of conscience, which, as it were, points me toward this phenomenological state of affairs that I cannot be a self without treating factic grounds as potentially justifying reasons. So that's what taking over being a ground in Heidegger's description means. And you might say, well, isn't that just as it were ontological as course guards or as objectionable? But it still has alternative. I'm still at issue there because I didn't go into this in the lecture, but I can either take over being a ground authentically or inauthentically. And so there's another dimension to this story that I'll go into later in a later talk. It may not clear everything up, but that's, I think, the structure that distinguishes the course guard's account, the transcendental argument from Heidegger's. The first question, I don't think between transcendental freedom and practical freedom, am I talking past what course guard is really getting at? I don't think I would want to say that, because I think what Heidegger is talking about here is, well, we'll see again when I talk about Kant in another lecture, but I think Heidegger is talking about practical freedom. I think he's not talking about a noumenal freedom he's talking about the kind of structure of our being that allows for practical identities. As you probably know, I mean, Heidegger's no big fan of a pure theoretical standpoint toward anything, and so a notion of transcendental freedom as we find in Kant's first critique, where it comes as the it's possible to think this transcendental freedom but not to know it. I think Heidegger is saying, no, this freedom is engaged in the world. It's practical freedom. Now, so I think he's really talking about what course guard is talking about, and that is to say, the whole issue of being bound by norms, and in her case by rational norms, and is a matter of practical freedom, and I think that's the whole issue of self-binding and being bound by norms belongs within that discourse of practical freedom. Heidegger actually in another text calls this whole notion of taking over being a ground, he calls it fundamental comportment. So he tries to bring his analysis of comportment in being and time together with this moment that I'm calling breakdown. But in no case is freedom a feature or faculty of or property of an entity called Dasein or the human being or whatever. It's mode of being, and it is. Or he sometimes calls it transcendence, and uses several words to do this, but focusing on freedom is my being. It's not property or of a faculty that I have. And I take it that that's quite close to what Kant actually does in his distinction between Willkür and Wille, where he really defines the will as practical reason and tries to distinguish it fairly sharply from mere Willkür. And so that's much in much the same way Heidegger is saying this kind of freedom that I'm describing, namely the freedom to self-bind in this way, is my being rather than some property that I otherwise possess. I'm not sure that really answers the question of whether whether my Heideggerian criticism of Korsgaard is talking past her, but that's how I would reconstruct at least part of that answer. The second question, yeah, I didn't write it down very well, but there was an issue between an ontological beginning and a descriptive beginning, I think.
I think you basically have already answered it. It's just asking you to clarify in what sense the Heideggerian argument is a transcendental one.
Yeah, I'm not using the argument. I'm not using the term transcendental argument in the very strict sense that it has taken on since the 1960s, where you're talking about really detailed analyses of what counts as a transcendental argument. What I'm basically trying to say is that in Korsgaard's case, she's starting with a premise that I think is controversial. Most people don't. Okay, we're human beings. We start with an ontology of human being as rational animal. And the transcendental argument is supposed to show that for you to care about anything, any other practical identity, being a father or a friend or a senator or whatever, you're also committed to treating your humanity, your rational animality as such an identity as well. I don't think that's strictly speaking, probably a transcendental argument in the original Kantian sense, but if we can even figure out what that is, but it's the attempt to find a necessary condition for other modes of behavior that are more accessible or less controversial. In Heidegger's case, I think there's something very similar, although I wouldn't exactly call it a transcendental argument because even I did in the paper, I removed some quotation marks and so on. I think transcendental phenomenology is quite different from, it proceeds descriptively and by virtue of what Husserl called eidetic variations of examples, rather than by argumentation, strictly speaking. And so in Heidegger's case, he's trying to describe a phenomenon that then he will try to motivate you to see that there are certain necessary conditions without which you could not have the experience of what he was describing. So our meaningful life requires that we be the kind of being in whose being that very being is an issue. But Heidegger merely asserts that at the beginning, and then in Division 2 of Being in Time, he tries to give you phenomenological evidence for that fact in this notion of existential breakdown. And once having seen that evidence, then one also sees that these other phenomena of caring about practical identities depend on it in some way. So it really, I'm using the notion of transcendental argument in that case quite loosely, only to connect it to the same kind of move that Korsgaard feels she has to make in order to explain how norms can get a grip on us. How they can get a grip on us, she explains through practical identities, but that doesn't get her far enough to derive the moral law from it. So she has to provide a kind of argument that will get you further by starting with the idea that we're human beings who need reasons in order to live. And then we take that as a practical identity itself. So I don't think that's a strictly speaking, a transcendental argument either, but she calls it one. So I'll follow her usage.
Any questions? No, but maybe just let me take advantage of my position as host, raising some questions here. So in your wonderful talk, I think against the Rawls paradox, you try to make Heideggerian conception of conscience, self-bending, competing against the Kantian tradition, either from Korsgaard or from Kant's notion of autonomy. But it says to me that you give a very strong empiricist reading of Kantian notion of autonomy. Namely, we have the moral maxim. It must pass a universalization test, and then it can be raised to the status of a moral law. But the problem here is not, for Kant, autonomy is the concept which is not applied to human beings, but also to other rational entities. So the autonomy doesn't presuppose this division as you suggested, namely the animality in human beings and the rational, intelligible part of the human beings. So in this sense, I'm just wondering to what extent the Kantian autonomy cannot answer the question which you think Rawls has raised in that kind of paradox, namely the self-determination, and also the everlasting or the permanence of the moral law. This kind of a tension. But I seek for Kant, at least if we understand the moral law, not from this empiricist tradition, but rather back to Kant himself, the moral law is already show a kind of self-bending, even for the rational entities. So here there seems to be a kind of the difference between your reading of Kant and the Kant himself, Kant's own notion of autonomy. The second point is, if the Kantian notion of autonomy as that kind of self-determination, which has never to do with the imperative, but then we have to understand this self-bending from the Kantian perspective. I don't see what kind of difference actually exists between the Heideggerian suggestion and the Kantian notion of autonomy. There seem to be both of them. There's this kind of self-bending, right? And it doesn't come from, as you suggested toward the end of your lecture, it doesn't, for Kant, this kind of claim doesn't derive from the autonomous faculty of reason. For Kant, yes, it comes from the autonomy of reason, self-legislation, but not just for human beings, but also for rational entities, right? So there's a self-binding even within this rational part. So I think this is one part of my question. Make clear what difference actually exists between Heideggerian conception of conscience and also the Kantian notion of autonomy. The second part of my worry, I think you make Heidegger too closer to Merleau-Ponty rather than Yes, why? Because when you, let me quote as you said, if we talk about this, the ground, you said, the responsibility for relating to my facticity in normative terms in light of what is that agato. Then the question for, I think for Merleau-Ponty or for Heidegger would be, what would be the origin of this, the best? Where does this, the best, this ability come from? And I think Heidegger would give an answer different from Merleau-Ponty, even though there's a general structure which is quite similar to each other, but still different. So my worry, your suggestion would make Heidegger too much like Merleau-Ponty rather than, you know, to make Heidegger's own position quite clear.
It's ironic that you say that, because I spend most of my time trying to convince my students that Merleau-Ponty is not the same as Heidegger, and quite so. If we just, the only thing I'm borrowing from Merleau-Ponty is the quote at the end.
The meaning and the normative, I know.
Because of meaning, we are condemned to meaning. But on the question of the origin of the best, which was kind of a part of your worry about that, idiatu agatu. I think this is a descriptive aspect of our the phenomenology of our life, and certainly with regard to the questions of how normativity pervades our experience of the meaningful world. That's a longer thing that I'll say more about later, but I'm a Platonist in this regard, that at a certain, in a certain way, I think it's fair to say that we act in light of what we think is best. I realize that what we think is best, what we take in the moment, even in the spur of the moment, and even when I think, oh, I know this isn't the best, I'm going to have 3 more drinks and then I won't be able to go home, you know. But at the time, I take that, let's say, incontinence as something better. It's better for me to stay here and drink at some level than to go home, because if I thought it was better to go home, I'd go home. And so this is obviously an ancient problem. And that is to say, it was described by Aristotle and Plato, and it's extremely controversial. These days, it's discussed under, do we act under the guise of the good? There's a whole literature on this kind of thing. And, but from the point of view of a description of our being in terms of practical identities, I think that or in terms of acting for the sake of being something, the guiding light in that case, trying to be a teacher, there's no rules for being a teacher. Or if there are rules, I can always modify them and break them. And I'm doing that because I think it's better to do it this way rather than some other way. And that's basically all I mean by being oriented toward the good or the best. Of course, I, like Aristotle, or, well, not like Aristotle, but I mean, I'm insisting that I don't know what the best is. That's what I'm calling the exemplar. When I have and this goes back to Kant's third critique, and maybe we can talk about that at some point, but there's an exemplary necessity to what I think I ought to do. and I bind myself to that in the moment. And that means I can't give a rule for it. I'm exemplifying it. This is what I take to be best in this moment. So there's more that I'll have to say about that, I hope, in future lectures. What's the origin of the best? I mean, that's what I'm trying to tease out of Heidegger's ontology by talking about the call of conscience and its strange structure. The call is characterizes me as guilty, but without any relation to law or ought. This yields in Heidegger's text this description of myself as a being who can never get its facticity into its power, but nevertheless is grounded by the facticity, but then must take over being a ground. This double-sided facticity transcendence structure just strikes me as exactly what the movement from being caused or being following an inclination blindly versus assessing it in light of better or worse. And assessing it in light of better or worse is what turns factic grounds into normative reasons. As Plato says, right? The answer to the question why is because it is best that it be this way. And, well, as Socrates puts it anyway. But I admit that that's all, I'm providing a strong reading of Heidegger. And in a future lecture, I'll talk about how I think the evidence that Heidegger believes this himself comes from the essay on the essence of reasons, Vom Wesen des Grundes. So I'll try to be a little more specific in the future. But that's the structure of my account, where reason isn't a faculty of a particular kind of animal, but arises in this structure, the care structure of having to take over being a ground. It's not a fundamental principle. It's an aspect of our being that we have to cultivate in a certain way, and we can succeed or fail at it in terms of whether we cultivate it authentically or inauthentically, which I'll also talk about a little bit more. Let me go back. Let me just talk about your point about the moral law in Kant holding for all rational beings and not just human beings is well taken, but all of what other rational beings are there? If there are Martians, Kant will say, well, you know, they're animals. I mean, if they're organic beings and, you know, organisms, they're animals, but they're also rational animals. And so this notion of natural kind, you're quite right, is not the real notion. The notion is, here's a bifurcated being that has rationality as one of its constituents. And that's the problem. There's no difference between Martians and human beings on this rational Martians and rational human beings. There's this bifurcated thing in Kant where there's a non-rational part and a rational part that has to govern that non-rational part. So they would have the same problem. However, there are two other issues on that, namely, Kant's explicit that God is a rational being, but because he doesn't have, or she doesn't have any inclinations, is a holy will. So the moral law is not an imperative for the holy will. The holy will does what reason dictates or whatever. The real question for theologians would be, what about angels? because they're supposed to be, well, it's puzzling. They can't be pure actus in Aristotle's sense, because they have to have some distinction from the deity, from God. They can't be pure souls or pure rationality, let's put it that way. So what is the type of material, so to speak, out of which angels are made? What distinguishes them from being pure actus? And there's a whole theology of this called angelology. I don't know anything about it, but people have tried to actually answer that question. And so for them, I don't know whether this super subtle material, as opposed to the Martian material or the human material, is distinct from their being in the same way that our animality is distinct from our rationality for course guard. I just don't know. But for the holy will, the problem doesn't arise. There is a moral law, but it's just the pure will of the holy will. And so it's not a demand, and there's no imperatives and all of that. But that's a very interesting question. I think that have I answered at least some of what worried you?
Yeah, the content, well, part of them, but I think the content notion of autonomy, well, it's still quite ambiguous whether we could equate the content notion of autonomy with categorical imperative. So if the autonomy involves this kind of autonomy nomos, right? There's a kind of self-binding structure within this autonomy rather than, within the categorical imperative. So in this sense, there seems to be a kind of self-binding which differs from what you suggest from either on the basis of Korsgaard notion of the self-binding, or let's just return to Kant himself. Then how to make differentiation between this Kantian notion of autonomy, self-binding, and Heideggerian one. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yes. That's a deep question. I'm not gonna. I mean, I'm using the term autonomy in this connection with Heidegger because I find it convenient, but it actually doesn't track what Heidegger. I mean, when I'm taking over being a ground in the way that I'm talking about it here, I'm binding myself not to a law. So it's not, strictly speaking, autonomos, right? It's, I'm binding myself to an exemplar or a Vorbild, an idea of the good. And I only call it autonomy because I'm giving myself that exemplar. So it's not autonomy in the Kantian sense. And I do agree with you, and this is an important point, because autonomy is not the same as the categorical imperative. You're absolutely right. The categorical imperative is a test to see whether your maxim conforms, to the form of law. And only when you actually do conform to the form of law are you acting autonomously, giving yourself a law. And my point is that by replacing reason with care, and I'll say something about this in the next lecture, Heidegger does away with this notion that normativity is essentially law. Right? So yes, you're right. And that's why I steer clear, for the most part, of saying that Heidegger is an autonomy theorist. I mean, there's something phenomenologically akin to the traditional notion of autonomy in Heidegger's ontology, but you're right, it's not the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I see some.
Just as like Habermas is an autonomy theorist in a way, but this whole dialogical structure that he develops to avoid monological reasoning in moral matters tracks the same point. So we'll talk about that a bit too more when we get to Darwin and in more detail.
Yeah, great, thank you. We have many audience online actually. So I see some of them raise hands for quite a long time. If you are happy, could we just invite them to read their questions? They are from other university. They are from other university.
Yeah. I'm fine with doing some more questions. Yeah.
Okay, then first, Lu Xinyu, please. Professor Lu Xinyu from Fudan University.
Thank you, Professor Liu. Thank you, Professor Crowell. I enjoy your lecture very much. I think it's very important work. It opens a new horizon for an ethical reading of Heidegger because there are many kind of accusations against Heidegger for his for the absence of ethics in his philosophy, such as from Levinas. It seems to me that your work kind of address this kind of reading or possibly misreadings about Heidegger. So that's why I like this lecture very much. I have a small question about the concept of conscience in Heidegger. I know, I mean, it's not kind of a skeptical idea against Heidegger or against your interpretation. It seems to me that the concept of conscience in both your lecture and in Heidegger's work signifies a possibility for human perfection, kind of possibly in the moral sense, but it's kind of a possibility for human perfection in the general picture. And this kind of general picture for human nature is pretty much close to many traditions like in Confucianism. But it's also, I can also sense skepticism from other traditions like from Christianity, because the idea of conscience, or in Heidegger's context, the concept of dread or anxiety or angst is kind of connected to other philosophers' concepts like Kierkegaard's dread or angst in Danish. So my question is that in their tradition, in both Christianity or other existentialists like Kierkegaard, the Socratic daimon or subjectivity is problematic in itself. So how will you answer to their potential challenges? I know that is not necessarily true, because from Confucianism or other traditions in the East Asia, we do believe that human natures are possible and open to this kind of self-perfection. So it's kind of maybe it's too big picture question, but I really enjoy your lecture. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for the kind words, and also for the really important and interesting question. The big topic, the role of place of ethics in Heidegger and its relation to various normative traditions and sometimes religious traditions, and this kind of question opens up a big space. I think I would. There's a movement there's a group of ethical theories called perfectionist theories, and I think that Heidegger would not be too friendly to the kinds of arguments that that one finds in those theories. Lists of things that go to make up a flourishing life. I think that he's too situational for that, I want to say. But there is definitely, the way I put that dimension of Heidegger's work into play is precisely through this notion of trying to enact an exemplar of what one thinks is best to do, an orientation toward the good. I don't think that entails perfectionism in how that term is often used in contemporary ethics, that there is some kind of list, that an objective list theory of what makes a human being the best it can be or something. I think that this orientation toward what is better, you might say, in a situation is definitely quite there and in Heidegger. And one needs to think kind of more about that. But what the role of the best or the better does in Heidegger is fleshes out the idea that is fundamental to his position that all the time, right, our being, to be Dasein is to be a being in whose being that being is always at issue, not just when I'm thinking about it, but in my mindless coping, in my just engagement in the world. There's a dimension of orientation toward the best or the better or the good that is structurally there in our being. It isn't added on through moral teaching. Let's put it that way. But it's always at issue, and so it's never definitive. And so lists of things that will perfect the human being, I think, are however much usefulness they might have, simply can't be grounded in a Heideggerian ontology. He thinks of ethics as the notion of dwelling on the earth, and we can go into that later. But the irony of the way you put the question is that, of course, most of the time Heidegger's notion of conscience is understood by people. Well, Dan Dahlstrom argues this way, and a lot of people do argue this way, that this whole existential analytic in Being and Time is just a secularization of the Christian story of the fall, right? That the human being is guilty. I mean, obviously Heidegger says, okay, what's the fundamental, what does the call of conscience say? And it says, you're guilty, but and people just stop at that. And, oh, okay, well, this is, and he further says, well, you didn't break any law or ought or anything. You're just guilty in your being. And this tends to sound like some version of the fall story in Christianity, so that then authenticity is supposed to be a striving to, get back to, I don't know. I mean, how can you overcome guilt by, original sin by striving for authenticity? I mean, no, you have to give yourself over to, I don't know how you get out of that situation if you're ontologically guilty, but and you understand that in the Christian moral sense, through faith and hope for grace, I guess. But it's a long story, but I just think this whole interpretation of Heidegger as a secularized version of the fall is just completely false. And so it comes from not understanding the phenomenological basis of Heidegger's argument in Being and Time, and not looking at the chapter in, not looking at how he describes what the formal indication of the term guilty actually means. And if one looks at that, that's what I'm just trying to do in this controversial passage that I keep coming back to, about taking over being the ground, that's what he says guilt means. And he says that guilty is a formal indication, which is a technical term in Heidegger that needs to be unpacked. But what it doesn't mean is that guilty is any old normal sense of guilt that we might think. And so people often complain about Heidegger because, well, you know, it's like Humpty Dumpty in Alice in Wonderland. If you can use guilty to mean shear the sheep or something, then I don't understand you. But Heidegger explains himself, and so that's what I'm trying to do, is bring out the non-theological and phenomenological aspects of this notion of guilt. But thank you for the question.
Yeah,
deep one. Thank you.
Stephen, can we take the last question, because the audience reads the question for
Yes, certainly.
Yeah, the last one, Professor Kalkas from I don't know, Hunan or Hubei University. Please be brave. Thank you.
Hi, Carl.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much. I'm gonna be very brief. First of all, thank you for this excellent talk, and thank you, Beijing University, for hosting this series. It's really nice. So my question also is about the link between normativity and morality, if I may. I think you have shown in your talk, the one argument was that normativity is first, or that normativity is fundamental. And you also showed us that there's not only normativity, but self-autonomy. There's a necessity for the self. My question is there also a third argument to be made here? An argument about the obligation to do the right, the good, the moral thing. And is this third argument perhaps derived, as you suggested, as you told us, from the fact that this self-binding is not only binding to the subjective self, but is a binding to the world? If so, this is additional remark, if so, is the world itself intrinsically normative for Heidegger? And is this perhaps what these lecture series will lead to, that Heidegger goes back into, develops a new kind of metaphysics? For me, last sentence, it sounded like while Heidegger tries to develop a new kind of metaphysics, where the world is showing us, if we're only sensitive enough to the world and the other people are showing us how to act, what is the best. It seems to me, is it correct that you favor the idea of this Platonic idea of that there are exemplars, Platonic ideals, and it's not the kind of natural law that you talked about earlier, but it seems to me that you seem to favor the idea of Platonic ideas of the exemplar. Is this your kind of metaphysics that you're trying to develop? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. That's a big question that I'm not going to be able to, or several that I'm not going to be able to fully answer in this time that we have. But it's an interesting way to put it. Do we have an obligation to do the moral thing, right? I mean, that was the first part of your question. Sure. You know, the only problem is that the moral thing is, I mean, the obligation involved points us in the direction of the fact that whatever we take the moral thing to be will be at issue for us, right? So it's not as though I can point to a system of positive laws, say some country or whatever, and say those laws are based on morality, you know. I mean, in a way, I won't draw Hegel into this, but you know, and so then we get into a debate about what morality is, and maybe we can say, well, morality is the best in relation, is what is best in well, I mean, in Kant, I mean, it's simply, okay, it's the law that governs the will in order for the will to be will, you know, one's will. That doesn't get me very far. And then what's the relation between morality and Sittlichkeit, you know? Or we can say with Habermas, you know, there are moral obligations are truly universal. They're not tied to any practical identity I have or whatever. And so in effect, that means, you know, there are ethical elements of the argumentative or dialogical situation which I cannot transgress, such as I have to, without performative self-contradiction, which, in terms of which then I have to let everyone speak with equal right and all of these kinds of things. My point about it is that these are all offerings by people who have come to understand morality in a certain way and are trying to theorize it. And the grounds of that are how they think it's best to go on in a certain historically developed context of argumentation. So that's what I mean by taking over being a ground and not only being responsible for what one takes to be the best, but also obligated, and I think this is the only moral obligation or universal obligation that I have said anything about in this paper, to give reasons, to give my reasons to the other person. That's the only universal, something quasi-moral imperative that I can find in this phenomenological reconstruction. And just to, there's a whole other, you said, does this mean that the world is normative? Well, yes, in a way, because the world is a normative structure of meaning. But if you mean the earth or the cosmos or something like that, I'm just going to go back to my insistence on phenomenological correlation. And so I'm going to ask you what you understand, like how do you constitute this notion of earth that you're appealing to, or cosmos that you're appealing to? And those, once you explain that to me, then that will show me your commitments and what those things mean, you know, what, as intentional objects, what does the earth mean to you? What does the cosmos mean? And there, the meaning of the idea that, let's say, things speak, or that we have obligations to things or to the earth, I'll have to answer that question only by going back to how you answer my question. So we won't get into that. But no, I don't think that atoms and molecules make any claim on us. You know, they're disclosed normatively, but I don't think they make any claim on us. But it's a far cry from atoms and molecules on the one hand to the landscape in which I live. But that landscape is part of the world, not part of the earth. So that's how I would answer that question. And then start to answer it. What was the other one? Yeah, maybe that's as far as I would go on this one. To connect this with the last question about ethics, I mean, I think Heidegger was very insightful in connecting the notion of ethics to the notion of ethos and the Greek notion of a den or lair or dwelling. And so ethics, in that sense, I think ultimately for Heidegger, and I am quite sympathetic to this view, is learning how to dwell, right? Learning what it is to be, and being is dwelling. So in some way or another, philosophically, one is going to bring that together with environmental issues, social issues in all kinds of ways. But fundamental ontology, as it were, is a basis for starting to think about how to touch on those issues. And that's as far as I've gotten in my old age. So thank you so much for your question.
Yeah, okay. I know many of you still have many questions, but we have run out of lecture time. I'm very sorry, we cannot take more questions. But today I have the impression we have a wonderful and very lively and inspiring start of the intellectual adventure with Professor Stephen Crow. I think in today's lecture, you have seen many suggestions, implications, and which the talk implies on understanding of Heidegger. So the Friday, this Friday, the lecture will be specifically focused on Heidegger's early work, namely Being in Time. And I think Professor Stephen Crow can promise to open a new dimension, how to make access to this very difficult and very interesting text, classical phenomenological text. So now let's once again thank Professor Stephen Crow for this wonderful talk today. And I want to see all of you back at the same time the day after tomorrow, because either, United States and China, the time difference, the day after tomorrow at the same time. Thank you very much. Thank you for your question, and thank Professor Stephen Crow. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all too. Thank you very much for your wonderful questions. And I will see you in day after tomorrow.
Oh, yeah.
Bye-bye.
So, we have leaving time, right? So the time, when we see Friday, and then that make people confused. The day after tomorrow is a human time.
Neutral, yes, that's right.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm excited to talk with all of you, and I hope we'll continue the conversation the day after tomorrow.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much. Have a good night.